I was working the night shift as a maintenance supervisor for the subway system, and let me tell you, the underground is a completely different world after midnight, when the last train rolls through, and the lights dim to that eerie emergency lighting that barely illuminates the tunnels. You start to realize you're not alone down there, and I'm not talking about the occasional homeless person who finds their way into the abandoned sections. I'm talking about something else entirely, something that makes your skin crawl and your heart race, even when you think you're prepared for it. The first time I encountered something I couldn't explain was about 3 months into the job. I was doing a routine inspection of the old section of tunnel that hadn't been used for passenger service in over 20 years, but we still had to maintain the electrical systems and check for structural issues. It was around 2 in the morning and I was walking through with my flashlight when I heard what sounded like a child crying echoing through the tunnel ahead of me. Now you have to understand that sound travels weird in these tunnels, everything gets distorted and amplified, but this was different, this was clear and it was coming from a specific direction. I followed the sound for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 2 or 3, and as I got closer I could make out that it wasn't just crying. It was sobbing, the kind of desperate sobbing that makes your chest tight. Just listening to it when I rounded the corner, where the sound was coming from, I found nothing, just an empty stretch of tunnel with old rusted rails and decades of grime on the walls. But the crying continued and it seemed to be coming from right where I was standing, like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. I called out hello thinking maybe someone was trapped or hurt, but the crying stopped immediately and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, just listening to my own breathing and the distant hum of electrical systems before I finally turned around and walked back the way I came. I filed a report but marked it as inconclusive and didn't mention the crying because honestly, who would believe that shit? The second incident happened about 2 weeks later and this time I wasn't alone. My partner Jake was with me and we were checking the ventilation systems in the deepest part of the network, about 40 feet below street level, in a section that most people don't even know exists. Jake had been working the tunnels for 15 years and he always said the underground had its own personality, that you had to respect or it would fuck with you. I thought he was just being dramatic until that night we were testing airflow sensors when Jake suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Do you hear that?" I stopped what I was doing and listened, and there it was, a sound like someone dragging something heavy across the concrete floor, but we were in a dead-end tunnel and there was no one else down there. We both looked at each other and I could see in his eyes that he was genuinely scared. Jake didn't scare easily. The dragging sound continued for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped, followed by what sounded like a door slamming, but there were no doors in that section, just smooth concrete walls. Jake grabbed his radio and called topside to see if anyone else was working in our area, but dispatch confirmed we were the only crew in that section of the system. We finished our work as quickly as possible and got the hell out of there. Jake didn't say much on the way back up, but when we reached the surface he looked at me and said, "In 15 years I've never heard anything like that down there and I hope I never do again." He put in for a transfer to day shift the next week and I never saw him again after that. The third story isn't mine, but it came from Eddie, who worked the tunnels for 30 years before he retired, and he told me this one night when we were having drinks after a particularly long shift. Eddie said he was working alone in the old abandoned platform that used to serve the financial district back in the 1930s, when the city first built the subway system. This platform had been sealed off for decades, but the city kept it maintained as a historical landmark and occasionally they'd send crews down to check on it. Eddie was replacing some light fixtures when he noticed that one of the old wooden benches on the platform had what looked like fresh scratches in it. Deep gouges that went all the way through the wood and into the concrete underneath. He said the scratches looked like claw marks, but they were too big to be from any animal that could survive down there. He took pictures with his phone and was about to radio it in when he heard footsteps echoing from the tunnel that led to the platform. Slow, deliberate footsteps that were getting closer. Eddie said he called out to identify himself as maintenance staff, but the footsteps stopped suddenly and he heard what sounded like someone whispering, but he couldn't make out the words. The whispering continued for several minutes and Eddie said it sounded like multiple voices all whispering at once in different languages, or maybe not languages at all, just sounds that almost formed words but not quite. He said the air in the tunnel got noticeably colder and he could see his breath even though it was summer and the tunnels usually stayed at a constant temperature. Eddie grabbed his tools and headed for the exit, but as he was leaving he looked back and saw what he described as a shadow moving across the platform, a shadow that was too tall and too thin to be human, and it was moving in a way that didn't match any light source in the area. He said the shadow seemed to notice him looking and it stopped moving for a moment before quickly disappearing into the darkness. Eddie never went back to that platform alone, and he said he always felt like something was watching him whenever he had to work in that section of the tunnels. The fourth encounter was reported by a track inspector named Maria, who was checking rail alignment. In one of the newer sections of the system, this was a tunnel that had only been in service for about 10 years. So there wasn't the history and urban legend bullshit that surrounded the older sections. But Maria swears what happened to her was real, and honestly, after everything I've seen down there, I believe her. Maria was working the early morning shift around 5 a.m. when the tunnels are completely empty except for maintenance crews. She was about halfway through her inspection when she noticed that the emergency lighting in the tunnel ahead of her was flickering in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like someone was flipping the switches on and off. Maria called the electrical department to report the issue, but they said all systems were showing normal on their end and there were no scheduled electrical work in that area. Maria continued her inspection, but the flickering continued, and as she got closer to the source, she realized the pattern was actually Morse code. She had learned Morse code in the military and she recognized the rhythm immediately. The lights were spelling out HELP over and over again. Maria stopped walking and called out to see if anyone was there, but there was no response, just the continued flickering spelling out the same message. She tried to radio dispatch, but her radio was getting nothing but static, which was strange because radio communications usually worked fine in that section of the tunnel. Maria decided to head back, but as she turned around she saw a figure standing at the far end of the tunnel silhouetted against the emergency lighting. The figure appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing like from the early 1900s, and it was just standing there watching her. Maria called out, but the figure didn't respond, and when she blinked it was gone. She practically ran back to the nearest exit, and when she reached the surface she found out that section of tunnel had been built over an old cemetery that had been relocated when the city expanded the subway system, but apparently not all the graves had been moved properly. Maria requested a different assignment and never worked that section again. She said she still has nightmares about that figure in old-fashioned clothes just standing there in the darkness watching her. The fifth story comes from a security guard named Robert who worked the overnight shift monitoring the subway cameras from the control room, but sometimes he had to go down into the tunnels to check on equipment or respond to alarms. Robert had been working security for the transit system for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen everything until one night when he got A call about a possible trespasser in the old maintenance tunnel that connected two of the major stations. This tunnel was supposed to be sealed off, but sometimes people found ways to get in. Robert grabbed his flashlight and headed down to investigate. When he reached the tunnel, he found the access gate was still locked and secure, but the motion sensors inside were going off, indicating that something was moving around in there. Robert used his master key to open the gate and stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow and lined with old pipes and electrical conduits, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of rust and decay. Robert followed the tunnel for about 50 yards when he heard what sounded like someone talking in a low voice, like they were having a conversation with someone else, but he couldn't make out the words. Robert called out to identify himself as security, but the talking stopped immediately and the silence that followed was complete, except for the distant hum of electrical systems. Robert continued deeper into the tunnel, and after another 30 yards he found something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the concrete wall were dozens of names and dates going back over 70 years. Some of the names were scratched into the concrete with what looked like fingernails, and some were carved deeper with tools, but what disturbed Robert the most was that some of the dates were recent, within the last few years, and below each name was a message that said, "I was here, I existed, I mattered." Robert took pictures of the wall and was about to radio for backup when he heard footsteps behind him coming from the direction he had entered the tunnel. Robert spun around with his flashlight but saw nothing. The footsteps continued getting closer, and Robert could hear what sounded like multiple people walking, but his flashlight beam revealed an empty tunnel. Robert backed toward the wall with the names and felt the concrete cold against his back. The footsteps stopped right in front of him, and Robert said he could feel the presence of people surrounding him even though he couldn't see anyone. The temperature in the tunnel dropped suddenly, and Robert could see his breath fogging in the beam of his flashlight. Then he heard the low talking again, but this time it was coming from all around him, like multiple conversations happening at once, but still he couldn't make out the words. Robert closed his eyes and counted to 10, and when he opened them everything was quiet and normal again. He quickly made his way back to the entrance and sealed the tunnel. Robert never mentioned the wall of names in his report, but he said he looked up some of the older dates and names and found newspaper articles about people who had gone missing in the subway system over the decades, people who were never found. The sixth encounter was experienced by a tunnel cleaner named Dennis, who worked the graveyard shift cleaning the platforms and track areas after the last trains had stopped running. Dennis had been doing this job for 12 years, and he prided himself on being thorough and professional, but there was one section of the system that always made him uncomfortable. It was an older platform that served one of the less popular stations, and it had a reputation among the maintenance crews for being creepy. Dennis usually saved this platform for last and tried to get through it as quickly as possible, but one night he was running behind schedule and didn't reach the platform until almost 4 in the morning. Dennis was mopping the platform when he noticed that the old wooden bench near the far end was occupied by what looked like a person, sitting perfectly still. Dennis called out to let them know he was cleaning and they needed to move, but there was no response. Dennis walked closer with his mop bucket, and as he got within about 10 feet of the bench he could see that the person was wearing old-fashioned clothes from maybe the 1920s or 30s, and their hair was styled in an outdated way. Dennis called out again, but the person didn't move or acknowledge him in any way. Dennis was starting to feel uneasy, but he figured maybe the person was sleeping or had headphones on, so he continued cleaning around them. But as he worked he kept glancing over at the bench, and he began to notice that the person wasn't breathing. There was no rise and fall of their chest, no subtle movements that living people make even when they're sitting still. Dennis stopped cleaning and stared at the figure for several minutes, and the longer he looked the more he realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The person's skin had a waxy pale quality and their eyes were open but completely vacant, like they were staring at nothing. Dennis backed away from the bench and called out one more time, but when he blinked the figure was gone. The bench was empty, as if no one had ever been sitting there. Dennis finished cleaning the platform in record time, and when he filed his report he mentioned that he had encountered a possible trespasser, but they had left before he could approach them. Dennis requested a different cleaning route the next week and never worked that platform again. He said he still thinks about that figure sometimes and wonders if what he saw was real or if the long hours and isolation of working alone in the tunnels had finally gotten to him. But deep down he knows what he saw was real, and he's grateful he never has to see it again. The seventh and final story is the one that convinced me to put in for a transfer to day shift, and it happened just 6 months ago. I was working alone in the deepest part of the tunnel system, about 60 feet below street level, in a section that had been abandoned for over 40 years. This area was supposed to be completely sealed off, but the city had received reports of strange sounds and lights coming from down there, so they sent me to investigate. I had to use bolt cutters to get through the old chain link fence that blocked the entrance, and as soon as I stepped inside I could feel that something was wrong. The air was thick and stale, like it hadn't been circulated in decades, and there was a smell I couldn't identify, something sweet and rotten at the same time. I followed the old tunnel for about 100 yards when I came to a large circular chamber that had been carved out of the rock. This chamber wasn't on any of the current maps, and I'd never heard of it before, but it was clearly man-made with smooth walls and a domed ceiling. In the center of the chamber was a pile of old bones, human bones that had been arranged in a careful pattern, like someone had been using them for some kind of ritual or ceremony. I called dispatch immediately, but my radio was dead, even though it had been working fine just minutes before I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal this deep underground. I knew I needed to get back to the surface and report what I had found, but as I turned to leave I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of children laughing echoing through the chamber, but there were no children down there. There was no one down there except me. The laughing continued, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls and ceiling of the chamber. I started walking quickly toward the exit, but the laughing followed me, and as I reached the tunnel entrance I heard something else, footsteps running behind me like children chasing after me. I broke into a run and didn't stop until I reached the surface, gasping for air and shaking from adrenaline. When I finally got radio contact I reported the chamber and the bones, but when the investigation team went down the next day, they found nothing. The chamber was empty and there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. They said I must have gotten disoriented and confused in the old tunnels, but I know what I saw and I know what I heard, and I know that something is living down there in the deepest parts of the subway system, something that doesn't want to be found. I put in for a transfer the next week and I've been working day shifts ever since, but sometimes at night when I'm trying to sleep I still hear that sound of children laughing echoing in my ears, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed down there just a little bit longer.